Hi, I'm Tori Whitcraft, and I'm a senior at Logan High School.
I'm Claire Borsheim, and I'm a senior at Logan High School.
In just a moment, Paul Schmitz from Leading Inside Out will be joining us. Paul helps build the collective leadership of organizations and communities to achieve greater social impact through his roles as Senior Advisor at the Collective Impact Forum and CEO of Leading Inside Out.
He is also the author of Everyone Leads, Building Leadership from the Community Up, and the former CEO of Public Allies, where he helped more than 5,000 diverse young adults begin careers working for community and social change. Paul is a faculty member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, was a social innovation advisor to the Obama White House, and has been named 3 separate years to the Nonprofit Times list of the 50 most influential nonprofit leaders in America. He lives in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with his wife and 5 children. Please welcome Paul Schmitz.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Could we move to the slides, please? So actually, what I'd like you to do, thank you, everyone. Oh, cool. That's a good start. At your tables for just a moment, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to imagine that your job is to create the worst collaboration ever. And I'd like you to think about what things you could put in place to make sure you created that. What kind of practices or principles would you put in a group to ensure that it just really sucked? That every time you went to a meeting, you spent more time in the parking lot afterward complaining about it. So just take a couple minutes at your table. I want you to come up with like a handful of things you could put in place to create the worst collaboration ever. Go. What could you put in place to have the worst collaboration ever? Lack of communication. Not open to new ideas. Egos. Disorganization. What else? Negativity, no follow through. Say it again. People who don't care. You guys are pretty good at this. Raise your hand if you've ever experienced any of these things before. All right. So what I want to talk about today is how do you build collaboration that doesn't produce those things? What does it take to create groups where people really can work together in different kinds of ways? And for me, that story starts, I was part of something called the White House Council for Community Solutions. We were part of the Domestic Policy Council, and our job was to find how are communities solving problems. And a lot of people came to us and said, let's find the best programs in the country that have evidence of success and focus on scaling them. And that made a certain amount of sense, but something was gnawing at me about it as we kept looking at all these great programs in different communities. And it really hit me in April of 2010. I live in Milwaukee, and the headline of the local newspaper that day was we had the worst 4th grade reading scores for African American children in the country. And that afternoon, I got a newsletter from the largest youth organization in the city boasting about all the outcomes they were achieving with the 15,000 children they serve. And that disconnect really hit me. I thought about how can we have all these great programs, and I'd visited a lot of them, and my kids had participated, and I saw how many great organizations we had, and I knew they were all measuring and meeting outcomes, and I knew they were doing all this great work. And I thought, how can you be doing all of this, and at the end of the day, we have this headline, year after year? And so I went back to our council and said, how about instead of looking for the one program that's doing well with 20 kids somewhere, are there cities where we're seeing the needle move? And right as we began that exploration, this article came out in the Stanford Social Innovation Review called Collective Impact that coined the term. And the important thing to note is John Caney and Mark Kramer did not invent collective impact. They were describing something that already existed. What they did was find in a bunch of cities that there were these things that were happening that were actually moving population level change in ways that it hadn't moved before. And our White House Council looked at 22 cities where there had been a population level measure that had changed by more than 10 points. And as we began looking at these, we found the same things they found in their article. And one of those cities that we ended up looking at was my own hometown of Milwaukee. Back in 2006, the city health department and the United Way brought all the groups together that worked on teen pregnancy for a summit. Same way you started with your summit. And at that time, Milwaukee's teen pregnancy rate for 20 straight years had been either number 1 or number 2 in the country. And in fact, in 2006, it was 2.5 times the national average. 2.5 times the national average. And they brought everyone together for a summit. And the first thing they recognized when they brought everyone in the room is almost everyone in the room served girls. And they realized there was another part of the problem. And not only that, but they started looking at data together and making sense of it. And one of the data points that no one in the room seemed to know before the summit was that the majority of teen births in Milwaukee, the father was over 18. And they realized there was another problem none of them were talking about or working on. Together, they developed a set of 3 strategies, an agenda that they focused everybody on. They got all these new actors and other groups to come into the space of working excuse me, on this issue. But as they began doing this, one of the big things they did was a big public relations campaign. And these ads were everywhere over the city for a few years. And I have to ask at this point, which do you think was the most controversial ad? So this is absolutely true, and it's an Only in America story, which is that there's an association of snake owners that want to increase the kinds and types of snakes that can be imported domestically as pets, and they don't like snakes represented in the media as devils and predators. And so they began calling the United Way, asking them to take down these ads. And Mary Lou, who is the CEO, said that of all the things they expected when they took on the issue of teen pregnancy and a lot of the controversial issues involved with that, the last thing they expected was to be attacked by the snake lobby. But the result is that it's gone down every year since, and the teen pregnancy rate in Milwaukee is now down over 70%, 70%, since 2006. And it's still going down. And while the national average has fallen, Milwaukee's fallen from 2.5 times national average to almost national average in that time. And that's what collective impact's about. It's not about let's all collaborate in a new way or find a new way to partner. It's about how do we actually move needles? How do we solve those problems that seem intractable? How do we actually measure change at a population level in a way that really makes a difference? And not just have great programs with outcomes, but actually see needles move. The way that we think of collective impact is that typically it begins with this notion of a common agenda. The idea that we have a set of strategies that we know are at the scale and complexity needed to move the needle. So if we're trying to work with a school district that has 5,000 kids graduating a year, we can't say, let's do a program with 100 people here and 20 there. We have to figure, what is the scale of work that needs to happen? And what are the models we need to bring in? And we look at what's the agenda that's at the scale and the complexity necessary to move the needle. We also have to be able to measure success as we go. In the teen pregnancy example, in the early years, the African American and white rates in Milwaukee were falling faster than the Latino rate. And the result of that was they formed a task force on the south side of the city that developed a new set of strategies, and they adapted their common agenda. And within a few years, all the numbers were falling in line. And that's because they were sharing measurement and data not to write a report at the end of the year and not to do a blink test, but they were doing it to manage the impact they were having. So the shared measurement was driving decision-making about the impact, about the work, and not just driving their ability to report at the end of the year on what they've done. They developed a set of activities where they looked at who had to do things differently. How did groups have to partner? How do we start working as a system to address systemic issues and not as a bunch of isolated organizations and actors? And they began thinking about other kinds of groups that could play a role. Bringing public health in with this public schools, bringing churches in, bringing a variety of players. My favorite partner they had, and this is true, is when they developed their set of strategies focused on the Latino community, they determined there were 2 stores on the south side of Milwaukee that were the primary stores that sold quinceañera dresses. And they worked with the owners of those stores to put pregnant mannequins in each store with bilingual, culturally appropriate kind of information, and train the staff to be able to converse with the mothers and daughters when they would come in and ask about it. And it was something that a group of Latino leaders had come up with, because they said that's the core time when you want to get messages to people, is at that age. And they said, we want to get messages where daughters and their mothers are talking to each other, and that's usually a place they come together. But again, when they asked about who are the partners, they thought outside the box. They didn't just think of what organizations, they thought of where are places and who are people who can participate in this work. And finally, they had continuous engagement. The notion of how do we engage the community in the work? How do we make sure we're communicating to people and everyone knows what's going on and this work's transparent and fair in the way it operates? And finally, they had a backbone staff. And that staff manages the process and makes sure the work flows and happens and supports the collaboration and the coalition work. Because so often coalitions, a lot of people come, they make commitments, and they go to the next meeting hoping no one remembers they made a commitment at the last meeting because they didn't get it done. And the goal of the backbone staff is to make sure that work gets done. And finally, though, what's needed is the text to stop blinking. Cool. So finally is needed is that we have to build a culture of leadership. Because Peter Drucker, the great management guru, says culture eats strategy for breakfast. And a lot of times I've worked with a lot of efforts that have built great strategies, but they haven't built the culture of collaboration that prevents that list of things you came up with earlier from happening. Because you can build a structure of collaboration, you can build a bunch of strategies, but if you don't build a leadership culture that supports it, it'll fail. It'll hit a wall. And so, with that, we're going to talk about culture. And what I'd like you to do to get that started is I'd like you to partner with somebody. And I'd like you to partner with someone you don't know. And I'd like you to share a story with them. And this is the story. I'd like you to think back, as far back as you can in your life, to that first time that you can remember that you stood up for yourself, you stood up for another person, you stood up for a cause or issue. But I want you to think back to that first time in your life you stood up for someone or something or yourself, the earliest memory you have of that. And I'd like you to share that story with each other. You've got about 4 or 5 minutes, so about 2 minutes a person. But I'd like you to share those stories. Go. I wrote this book a few years ago called Everyone Leads. And it doesn't mean that everyone should be in charge at the same time. What it does mean is that leadership's like a muscle. And like any other muscle in our body, it only gets stronger with exercise and practice. And the goal of any organization or community is how do you strengthen that muscle? How do you build the collective leadership muscle of an organization or group to solve problems? And that first time you step up, whether it's to a bully in school, or whether it's to a cause that inspires you, or whether it's on behalf of a family member, whatever that is, that's when you start building that muscle. And the important thing to understand is every single person has it, and it can be developed among all people. And so I want to share a few stories that help me kind of get to the way that I've come to view leadership. And the first is Biz Nash Talbot Scott. Biz was an 18-year-old single mother. She had a child at 15. She was in community college in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she came to my organization, Public Allies. She describes herself as someone who knew she was smart but had no idea of her potential. She ended up working at an after-school program. And while there, recommitted to her own education. She got into college. She got into Marquette University, did very well. Went to University of Michigan for law school. Made the law review, clerked for a federal judge. moved to Washington to begin a legal career. And the last administration rose to become director of White House presidential personnel. Most people don't look at a single-teen mother in community college and think there's a White House lawyer. Peter Hoffel was a different kind of story. Peter was 27. He had gone to college. He got a degree in philosophy, which meant that he worked at a deli. And they had really cool sandwich names. And one day, a woman came into the deli asking if she could hang a poster advertising opportunities at Public Allies. And he struck up a conversation with her. And the posters were saying that they were seeking young people who were passionate about making a difference and would help them begin careers working for social change. And he struck up a conversation with her. And he describes himself as someone who'd stayed up late at night with his friends, drinking beers and talking about politics and social issues, but never thought he could do anything about them. So the first thing he did after she left is he tore down the poster. He said that he didn't want anyone else to know about it so he could get in. He got in, and he ended up working at a legal action organization, a legal aid organization. And there he began specifically working with people with disabilities. And he found he had a passion for that population. Today, he's the CEO of the National Alliance of Mental Illness in Wisconsin and one of our state's top disability rights advocates. And again, most people wouldn't look at the person making your sandwich and think there's a leader we need. I had the joy of doing that over 6,000 times across the country, looking for leadership where no one is looking. And finding again that that muscle could be developed in all kinds of people. The reason why I'm so passionate about this, and this will be my Randy moment, is that was me. I was someone who grew up struggling with addiction and depression. I was institutionalized when I was 16. I was homeless when I was 18. I went to college through a vocational rehabilitation program. As things came together for me, and the services and mentors who had helped me, I felt a responsibility to pay that forward, and I didn't know where to go. And I got a chance through the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I was in school, to attend a conference in Racine. And the first night I sat down next to this woman, and she told me she had just started this new nonprofit called Public Allies. And they were in Washington, D.C., and they were looking for young people who wanted to make a difference, would help them begin careers, working for social change. I said, that's exactly what I want to do. How can I do that? And she said, why don't you start one in Milwaukee? And with all the experience I had as a gardener and a telemarketer at an insurance agency, I decided to start a nonprofit organization. And it was a bumpy road, but I wouldn't have imagined that 3 years later I'd become the national CEO, move its headquarters to Milwaukee, grow it to 25 cities, become an advisor to a president, author, and a professor at a university, and many other things I've had the chance to do since. But it's my own experience and the experience of so many young people I worked with, like Peter and Biz, that makes me believe what's possible when we think differently about leadership. The way that we came to define leadership was that first, it's an action everyone can do, not just a position few people hold. When we shift our thinking from the noun to the verb, it really opens up the possibility of who can participate and what it means. The second is the essence of leadership, if you think about it. It's essentially an act of responsibility. It's stepping up and owning a result. It's deciding, I'm going to make this happen. I'm willing to do what it takes, learn what I have to learn, work with whoever I have to work with to make it happen. And that's why no one can really give you leadership, and no one's really entitled to leadership. It's a responsibility you have to own. And then if you think of those leaders you most admire and those you don't, if you think about those people you love being on teams with and those you don't, think about the best or the worst boss or supervisor you've ever had. The difference isn't how technically skilled they were at their work. It's all about values. And values are the secret sauce of leadership. It's what defines and makes a leader great or good or someone you love being on a team with and working for, working with, is that they practice values that connect people together and not values that divide people. And so if we think of leadership as an action, an active responsibility, and a practice of values that hold a group together, that's what it takes to think differently about leadership. But I want to tell a story, and it's a story that you all know, but I'm going to tell it to you in a way you might not have heard it before. And it's a story that to me illustrates this notion of collective leadership better than any other story I know, and it's a story of Mrs. Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. And we have to start with Mrs. Parks. She was a lifelong rebel and radical. As a child, she got into fights when she was mistreated. She had always stood up for herself. In 1932, she fell in love with her husband Raymond, a barber. Because of his activism, there was a case called the Scottsboro 9 case, in which 9 young men had been falsely accused of rape, and he became a community organizer in the effort. And she said it was his activism she fell in love with, and he was the first person radical enough for her to marry. In 1943, they went to their first NAACP meeting. The NAACP was really at that time the association of the professional class of African Americans, the talented 10th they called them. And they were working class people. She was a seamstress and Raymond was a barber. But they found out that E.D. Nixon was running to be president of their local chapter. He was a porter on trains, and if elected, he'd be the first working class president of an NAACP chapter in the country. And so sure enough, they go to their first meeting, and Nixon gets elected president, but no one runs to be secretary that night, and Rosa Parks was the only woman in the meeting. So at her first meeting, she gets railroaded into becoming the secretary of the NAACP, a position she holds for the next 12 years. And it's important to pause for a moment on the fact that in this role, it was her job to document all of the cases of mistreatment, discrimination, abuse, and terrorism in the community for over a decade. She was the repository and documenter of all the community stories. Through the NAACP, she went to trainings in Georgia and Florida by the master organizer, Ella Baker, who was the national field director of the NAACP, and had been building leaders throughout the South for an emerging movement. And she became a mentor of Rosa's, and among other things, encouraged her to create a youth council in Montgomery, which she did, in which she worked with young people on ways they could stand up to segregation in the city. Then one day she was working in her job as a seamstress for Clifford of Virginia Dewar. Clifford had been a New Deal lawyer in the Roosevelt administration who'd moved back to Montgomery, and his wife was an ally of civil rights. And they began talking to her about her NAACP work when they suggested that she go to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which ran trainings in nonviolent civil disobedience for diverse groups of activists from the South. And when Rosa Parks expressed interest, Virginia Dewar raised the money to sponsor her to go to Highlander and actually took the bus with her to Knoxville, Tennessee to make sure she got there safely. At Highlander, she was trained by Septima Clark and Miles Horton, who also became important mentors in her life and began corresponding with and supporting her work when she got back. They saw her as a real emerging leader in the movement. And she said that Highlander had a profound impact on her life. She said it was the first time in her life that she had lived in an interracial community where everyone was treated equally, and it gave her a vision of the society she wanted to live in. And I have to pause here for a moment to note that the Highlander Center was just burned down by arsonists in April of this year, just 6 months ago, who had left white supremacy signals and Nazi signs in the space. But this retreat center that's been a cradle for many social movements in America was just burned down this year. Then Fred Gray moved to Montgomery. He was a 24-year-old lawyer who was the first African-American lawyer in Montgomery, the second in the state of Alabama. And Rosa Parks took him under her wing, and every week would bring him out to lunch and bring all these cases she had been documenting for over a decade to see which could be turned into civil rights cases they could prosecute under the law. Then in February of 1955, Claudette Colden, a 15-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery, was arrested. How many people have heard her name before? Just a few. Rosa Parks, Virginia Dewar, and others had argued they should use this case to take on the segregated system in Montgomery. But the lawyers, who were all men, decided she wasn't sympathetic enough. They said she was too poor. They said she was too dark-skinned. They said she allegedly resisted arrest. There were rumors she was sexually active. And they chose not to take her case. 8 months later, in October of 1955, Mary Louise Smith, an 18-year-old member of Rosa Parks Youth Council, refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and was arrested. How many people know her name? Once again, the lawyers go to their home. They're very poor. Her father's a drunk. And they decide in the end that she also wouldn't make a sympathetic enough case to win a national case on civil rights. And they don't take her case. 6 weeks later, Thursday night, December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and is arrested. How many people have heard her name before? Good. So it's important to note here that on the 100th anniversary of her birth, the White House proclamation and even the obituaries when she died often referred to her as an accidental activist or someone who inadvertently started a movement. How accidental does she sound at this point? So Clifford and Virginia Dewar go to get her out of jail, and they go back to her home, and they meet up with her husband Raymond, and they talk for the next few hours about the idea of using her case as the one to take on segregation in Montgomery. And she and Raymond know they'll lose everything if they do this. But they make the courageous choice, and they did. They lost their jobs, they lost their house, they lost everything. But they make the courageous choice to go forward. So E.D. Nixon calls Fred Gray and asks him to represent his friend Rosa in court that Monday. And then he called Joanna Robinson, who headed the Women's Political Council of Montgomery. The Women's Political Council was an association of African-American professional women, and for 2 years they've been urging the male-dominated NAACP to organize a bus boycott. And he calls her, again, this is Thursday night, and says, we're going to do a bus boycott Monday, can you get the word out? And Joanna's an English professor at Alabama State University, a historically black college, but a state institution, and she goes and overnight prints 15,000 flyers on state equipment using state ink and state paper. Not great graphic design, mind you. But if I asked any of you to make me 15,000 copies in the next 24 hours, you would freak out with the technology we had today, and she was using a hand crank. And all the women met her Friday morning at 6 a.m., and they fanned every bus stop in Montgomery with flyers announcing that on Monday there'd be a bus boycott. And then this is true and absolutely how it happened. E.D. Nixon called Reverend Ralph Abernathy at Holt Street Baptist Church and asked him if he could convene all the pastors in town for a meeting on Friday afternoon, so on Sunday they would all from the pulpit call for the boycott. And he said, I've got a better idea. There's this new young pastor in town and no one knows him. Let's do the meeting at his church because if he gets run out of town, no one will notice. And that is literally how 26-year-old Martin Luther King was drafted into the civil rights movement. The pastors met at his church at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church that Friday afternoon. It's the first time most of the pastors have met Dr. King. They were inspired and impressed by the young man, but they just saw him as the new young man in town. And I should also note that the summer before he was in Montgomery, his internship as a pastor was in Brooklyn, and the evaluation that went back to his theological school, it was that he was too haughty and could not connect well to ordinary people. But that day they connected. And one white pastor attended that meeting, Robert Gratz, who happened to be Rosa Parks' pastor. And his home was bombed 2 weeks later and was found out he had attended that meeting. That Monday, no one rode the buses. Everyone walked to school, they walked to work, they walked everywhere. And that night they had a mass meeting at Holt Street Baptist Church, and over 5,000 people came. It was standing room only, and there was people standing outside. And they asked the community to vote if they wanted to continue the boycott, and the community voted unanimously to continue it. So they decided that night to create an organization to manage the boycott, the Montgomery Improvement Association. And Rufus Lewis was a rival of E.D. Nixon's. He had lost several elections to Nixon to run the NAACP, and he didn't like the idea that he, a college-educated business owner, kept losing to an unlearned porter on trains. And he didn't want Nixon to run the new organization that night. But he didn't think he could beat him, so he hatches a plan, and he goes before the audience and says, we're too divided as a community, we have too many factions. For us to hold together in this effort, we need someone completely neutral to lead us. And he's a deacon at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, so with hopes of pulling the strings behind the scenes, he nominates his young new pastor, Martin Luther King, to be that neutral leader, which is how King that night becomes head of the MIA. King calls his father in Atlanta, who's the most prominent pastor there. And his father connected him to a pastor in Baton Rouge where there had been a bus boycott. This wasn't the first. And that pastor said, people walk for maybe a week, and then you got to figure out how to get them everywhere. And so King appointed Lewis transportation chair, and Rufus Lewis organized a 350-car carpool that transported the entire community to school, church, work, and shopping for 12 months. To raise money for this, two women, Inez Ricks and Georgia Gilmore, created competing clubs of women who made and sold food during the week. And every Monday they competed to see who brought the most money to the mass meetings, which went to all the drivers for all the gas costs and all the tickets police kept giving them. Then Ella Baker took Rosa Parks on a tour of the North to raise money from NAACP donors. The Hortons and the Doors hit up the community around Highlander. And then Bayard Rustin came to town. E.D. Nixon was a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters Union, the largest African-American union. Its master organizer and strategist was Bayard Rustin. Rustin was a controversial figure, though. He had been the campus organizer for the Communist Party of America in the 1930s, and we're now in the McCarthy 50s. He had then gone to India, became a follower of Gandhi, sat out World War II in jail as a conscientious objector, as a pacifist. And he was an openly gay black man in 1955 New York. They called him Brother Outsider. But he was the genius strategist of the movement. And so Rustin is sent down to Montgomery to support Nixon. And he hears about this young pastor, and they go to Dr. King's home. And Dr. King has a man stationed on his front porch with a shotgun, a man on his roof with a shotgun, and Dr. King's carrying a sidearm. Up to that point, all the civil rights marchers carried weapons to protect themselves against the white supremacists. And Rustin sits down with them and talks about the idea of using this movement to practice a Gandhian nonviolent civil disobedience campaign. And King had read Gandhi in graduate school and was quite excited by the idea. And Rustin said, first, no more weapons. You have to get rid of all the guns. And he said, secondly, 85 members of the Montgomery Improvement Association have now been indicted by the local police. He said, can you organize them all to put on their Sunday best, march down to the jail together, and turn themselves in, which they did. It was the first mass civil disobedience of the movement. But they were worried that this gay pacifist communist from New York was going to be found behind the scenes in Montgomery. So he moves into a hotel room in Birmingham where he coaches and counsels King every day for the next year, and in fact for the next 13 years. And in fact, it was he and Ella Baker who co-founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to create a platform for a national civil rights movement coming out of Montgomery, and Ella Baker was its first executive director. And he's the man who organized the March on Washington and much else. But Rosa Parks had been an officer in the NAACP for over a decade. Her husband had once been an organizer in an effort funded by the Communist Party to decide that she also isn't a sympathetic enough figure to win a case. So yet another woman who had refused to move to the back of the bus in Montgomery and been arrested, Aurelia Browder, how many people have heard her name? It was her case that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court that overturned segregation in the South. So the question is, who is the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott? That's how change happens. We love stories of heroic leaders, but the reality is that change happens when lots of leaders work together. It's always about a collaboration among leaders. And there are different roles for leaders. And the charismatic leader who can inspire a group is an important role, but it's only one role. And King and Parks would have been the first two to recognize in their own writings and speeches the role that all the other leaders played in their efforts. They understood that very clearly, that it was a collaboration among leaders. And it doesn't diminish King's genius or Rosa Parks' immense courage to recognize that. But when we think about change, how do we think about building those kinds of tables? Tables that can build leadership at many different levels. So if we think of leadership as an action lots of people can do together, if we think of that action as taking responsibility to contribute to the result, and the practice of values that can hold together, then the question becomes, what are the values that work best to create that kind of leadership? And I'm going to go a little bit faster than this. We were going to have another activity, but unfortunately the tech got kind of broken, so my apologies for that. But I want to keep you on time, so I'm going to cut things a little bit. About 25 years ago, there was a pastor in Cincinnati who was new to his church, and his church operated a soup kitchen. And he visited the soup kitchen, and when he did, he found that it was one of the most depressing places he had been. And he asked to meet with the volunteers from his congregation who operated the soup kitchen. And when he met with them, he asked them about how they operated. And one of the things they shared with him excitedly is not only did they provide people food, but they identified what other needs people had and would refer them to other services. And they said, we have an intake process, and they showed him a survey they would use when people came to get food that they would use to ascertain what other kind of needs they had. And he looked at them and said, so the way we start a relationship with someone is by asking these questions. And there were questions about things like homelessness and drugs and abuse and work and all these other things. And he said, and the only things that they know that we know about them are the answers to these questions. And he said he threw it in the garbage and said, we're going to start a new intake process. When people come to eat for the first time, I want to hear about what they have. I want everyone interviewed about what gifts they have. What is it they love doing? What is it that makes them a great family member, friend? What is it they love doing? What is it they're good at? What are the skills they have? And what is it they love doing so much they get lost in it? I want everyone introduced by their gifts. And they started doing that, and they found the most common skill that people had was cooking. So he told the volunteers, stop making food, they've got that. And he took Polaroids of people. If you don't know what that is for the younger folks, you can Google it. But they created a wall of fame in the cafeteria, and they put a list of people's gifts up with a Polaroid, and his challenge to his congregation was to build relationships with people and do work with them in the community based on shared gifts. And he broke down the ceiling between what had been a church community and a church basement community and created one community that went on to do a lot of other community development work. And what Damon was doing is something we call being asset-based. And it answers the age-old question of the proverbial glass, is it half empty or half full? And the correct answer is yes. It's both. And that glass is like every single one of us and everyone we work with and serve. Every single one of us have fullness. We have gifts and talents that make us great family members, great friends, great workers, great leaders. We all have that. It's what brings us to these rooms and to the work you do. We all have fullness. But every single one of us also has emptiness. Things we don't do well, mistakes we've made, regrets we hold. We all have both, but community service is often people who've been defined by their fullness going into communities that have been defined by their emptiness to help people who've been labeled by their emptiness with the notion that our job is to fill them up with some of our fullness. And we think that at best is oppressive, at best arrogant, and at worst oppressive. We think that great leaders are those that even when staring into an individual or group's emptiness, they find the fullness. They see what's working in community, not just what's lacking. They see an individual who's struggling and they still see what they can do and define them by that. That we recognize that our closest confidants know our emptiness more than anyone, right? And they're the people we open up with and share our struggles with. And why do we do that? We do that because we know no matter what we share with them, we know they'll always see us for our fullness. We have complete confidence that it won't change their perspective on us. And yet when we serve or work with young people or others in communities, when they think all we see is their emptiness, do we think they're really going to open up? Would we open up to someone who defined us or saw us only based on that? When people know that we see and acknowledge and recognize their gifts, their willingness to work with us, to talk to us about their emptiness is far greater. And it means we can never label anybody by the worst mistake they've ever made unless we want to be labeled by that. It means that when we are in a community, we start to notice not only what's lacking, but what's working. We notice that the women who check in on the young mothers in our neighborhood are part of public health. We notice that the men who watch the kids on the playground after school every day are part of youth development. We notice how people come together in neighborhoods, and we recognize different ways of working. In Milwaukee, our library system was trying to address summer slide, as I'm sure a lot of you are concerned with. And when they thought about how to contribute that, the normal response would have been, let's partner with literacy organizations or youth organizations. But they said the greatest disparity in our community was with young African-American boys. And they said, who has relationships with that population? Which is a different question than who serves that population. And one of the new answers they came up with were barbershops. And they partnered with barbershops throughout the city of Milwaukee, to become library hubs, and where boys between haircuts could take out books that were recommended by their barbers. And if they had read 3 books during the summer, they got a free back-to-school haircut paid for by the library system. But the library system wasn't asking the question we often ask, who serves them, they ask who already has relationships. And when we start to ask those questions in communities, we start to think of different kinds of partnerships that already know people based on their assets, not just relationships with people who see their needs. The second value is about equity and inclusion. And for a long time in social services, philanthropy policy, there's been a focus on equality as a frame. And an equality frame simply is that we're going to develop a service that moves people to outcomes, and the important thing is to get everyone equal access to the same service or intervention, with the notion that that intervention will move everyone to the same outcome. An equity frame recognizes the problem with that is that people don't start in the same place. And it means that if people are starting in different places, we have to differentiate what we provide to people at different places to move everyone to that common result. Another way that we like to think about that is a lens and a mirror. And an equity lens, it means that what we do is we disaggregate our data in a community. We understand, are there disparities in our community based on race or gender or geography or some other difference? But we notice that there's some populations that are consistently further behind others in the outcomes that we seek. And if we understand that, then we ask, what are the special barriers or things that would help us differentiate what we do to help those further behind move to get to the same outcomes as everyone else? It's often called targeted universalism. But the idea is that we have to differentiate what we do to move everybody to the same result, because people don't start in the same place. But I would argue as important as putting an equity lens on our work is putting an equity mirror on our work. And that means asking who's at the tables making decisions about our communities. And the questions I would ask is, if we're working on a group of people, a population in a specific part of a community that are facing certain issues, how many of us at the tables making decisions live in the neighborhoods our work is targeting, or have lived there, or have family members there? How demographically reflective is our table of the community or population we're serving? Do we have people with other forms of difference? How many people at our table have lived experience on the issues we're working on, or have had family members with lived experience? How many of us work with the population directly every day, or even supervise those who do? And if the answer is we're all on the outside, do we really have the best information about the population, the issues, and the neighborhoods to make the best decisions about what's needed? And if not, how do we correct for that so we make sure we don't make mistakes? Because there's two kinds of expertise. There's content expertise and context expertise. And about a year ago, you might remember, there were a group of Thai soccer players who were stuck in a cave in Thailand. And Elon Musk came to the rescue, Iron Man. And he has the best engineers. They build electric cars, a new electrical grid, rockets that can go to space. And he says, I'm going to bring my best engineers together. We're going to design a submarine overnight to rescue all these boys. And they built a submarine. But it didn't work. And that's content expertise. We bring people who have knowledge together to solve a problem in community, but what they're lacking is the context. Because what really rescued those boys in the end were cave divers who understood the way that water flowed. They understood the dynamics of the caves. And they were able to design a solution that rescued all those boys. And the question is, when we work on solutions in our communities, are we relying more on the Elon Musk people who bring in expertise from outside? Or do we rely on the cave divers in our community, those who know how things actually work on the ground and what's not worked in the past and who people trust and who they don't? And ideally, if Musk wanted to help, what he would have done is flown his engineers there to serve and support the cave divers. Because it's not an either or, it's a both. But the question is how you bring content and context expertise together. Because to solve difficult, complex problems in communities, you need both. The third is about collaboration, which is all about trust. And here the simple idea is that the absence of conflict is not a positive measure of collaboration. But there's two kinds of conflict. There's conflict which happens in the room, where we debate ideas, where we hold each other accountable, where we give constructive criticism. And that produces innovation and learning and progress. Then there's destructive conflict. Destructive conflict is when we go outside the meeting, back to our cars, and we complain about the meeting for the next hour in the parking lot. And that produces nothing of value. And the question is, how do you bring the parking lot conversation into the room? And that takes trust. It means we have to build relationships with each other as individuals, not just as name titles organizations. It means we have to have a transparent and fair process where there's not a meeting before the meeting. That's the real meeting. But that everyone feels that they're on the same path and they've got we've got fair brokers and honest brokers in our process. It requires that we build the skills of having difficult conversations. Because without difficult conversations, we can't make real progress if we're all just polite all the time. But that's what it takes to build that kind of trust. The fourth is continuous learning. And about 10 years ago, the Echoing Green Foundation in New York, which funds social entrepreneurs around the world starting new nonprofits, asked me to come in and share about how we built Public Allies. And I started writing a speech about all the things we did, and I realized it really wouldn't help anyone. So I created a different presentation called The Worst Practices of Social Entrepreneurship. And I cataloged the 10 biggest mistakes I or my organization made in our first decade that I'd do over if I could. And before sharing this publicly, I thought I should share it with our staff. But I was kind of scared that morning because the first slide of the deck was called Things I Suck At. And the reason was because I realized that if I had been more self-aware of these things earlier, I would have hired better, I would have delegated better, I would have collaborated better, I would have been less defensive, I would have been more supportive, I would have been a better listener. I realized I would have been a far better leader if I'd been more aware of these things early. But putting this list in front of my employees was really scary. And then something happened. Everyone started nodding. And the reason is because the things you suck at aren't a secret. If you're always late, everyone knows it. If you talk too much and dominate meetings, everyone knows it. If you say nothing in the room and everything at the water cooler in the parking lot, everyone knows you do that. Whatever it is, everyone knows. And you have a choice as a leader. You can own those things, which create the possibility that people talk about them with you, or you don't own them, and people talk about it without you. Why are we in the parking lot complaining about Ralph from the meeting? Because we don't believe that Ralph is self-aware, that we can give him that feedback. But if Ralph says to us, listen, I have a tendency to talk too much in meetings. If I'm doing that, let me know. He just saved me 10 hours of parking lot time in the next year. And he might still be defensive at first, but because he's aware, at least we can break that down. Every leader has to have confidence in what you bring and humility about what you don't. None of us has the whole package. We all have to have both. And just because I have a list of things I suck at doesn't mean I get to go, hey, I don't have to do those things now. It means I have to make sure I have people on my team who are good at those things. I have to be held extra accountable to those things. I need tools and development to continue improving on those things. They're just the things that don't come naturally. But if we own these things, we create that space. But we have to first recognize confidence in what we bring and humility about what we don't. And that's what really makes leadership great. And finally, it's about integrity, which is all about our accountability. If leadership's an act of responsibility, then the price of that is accountability. And the question is, how do I hold myself accountable to my own purpose and values? There's a reason we do this work. There's a lot, you all care. There's a lot of people who don't care. You've made a choice in your career because you care. Why do you care? And there's an accountability to that, to whoever influenced you, or to your faith, or whatever that is that drives your work. There's accountability to values that you want to be held accountable to as a leader. And of course, the promises we make to each other and to the community that we serve and the people we serve. And it's how we hold all that accountability together and integrate that. That's our integrity. That's our own backbone as a leader. And leadership without accountability is not leadership. That's just being bossy. But when we're accountable, that's what leadership is. So if we think of leadership as an act everyone can do, as taking responsibility to work with others, and we think about values, from how do we recognize and engage others' assets and start there. How are we equitable in our work in making sure both that we're solving for disparities in our communities, but also engaging people from our communities in the work? How do we be collaborative in creating transparent and fair processes and building relationships of trust with each other so we can keep the parking lot conversations in the room? How do we build a learning culture where we ourselves recognize what we bring and what we lack and are willing to have those conversations and ask for help and ask for support and hold each other accountable to that? And finally, how do I hold myself accountable as a leader to my own purpose and values, to the promises I make through my work, and ultimately to the people on whose behalf I do the work on the community? And if we do all that, that's the leadership that it takes to do this work well. So I want to thank you all both for enduring our long break with the technology problems, and for coming here this morning, for the work you do in lacrosse. And I want to just recognize, I've been working for the last few years with the Better Together folks, Diana Diaz Granados and Catherine Kolkmeyer and Bethany Tier, and it's been wonderful to spend time in lacrosse. I'm actually coming back next month. So it's wonderful to be with you all in the Driftless area. I'm learning. But it's beautiful here, and I've had a lot of fun here. And thank you so much this morning, and thank you to the band and Randy, and hope you have a great rest of your day.